Today, I'm so excited to welcome my friends Mindy and Juliette to the podcast. Today, they'll be talking about their book called Teaching Conceptual Understanding in Multilingual Classrooms. Mindy and Juliette, welcome to the podcast.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for having us.
Before we start, can you share a little context of where you are and a little background of your work right now?
Juliette, would you like to start?
Okay, no problem. So my name is Juliette van Eerdewijk. I'm a educational consultant and trainer. I live in the United Arab Emirates, and I have been in international education in leadership positions for over 40 years. So I am delighted to share what I have learned in the book.
And my name is Mindy McCracken, and I'm currently the primary EAL, English as an Additional Language leader at the International School of The Hague Primary. I've been at the school for a number of years, and I've been really, really fortunate to be partnered up with the ECIS network, particularly in the field of multilingualism. I was part of the MLI committee for a number of years, where I came into contact with researchers like Jim Cummins, Ewan Crisfield, and Ophelia Garcia, who have been very influential in influencing the work that I do every day with multilingual students, and the journey that we're on in our school to bring translanguaging and additional language practices to life.
So let's start with your book. Why did you write this book?
Well, the idea started actually with me, and it really grew out of what I was seeing in the international schools around the world where I was working. And I noticed that in a lot of these international settings, there still is very much the English only philosophy. So, therefore, creating monolingual students, as we then see that they reduce the home language to just everyday speaking, and they are no longer developing the fully academic written language in their home language. One of the other key issues that I experienced was that teachers are just simply not trained to work in truly multilingual schools. And so the student body being multilingual causes a bit of an issue for the actual teachers. Much of the training is usually available and is designed around monolingual context. And often that is based on, let's face it, English speaking countries with native English speaking students in mind. And so when these teachers are then moving into an international school or, of course, linguistically diverse classrooms in any setting, of course, they are then basically left to sort of put all the pieces together themselves. What I noticed was that there's also often the belief that students can actually not access higher order thinking skills, or they are considered not to be very clever. And so when I later trained to become a trainer in concept-based curriculum and instruction by Erickson and Lanning, that's when things really started to click for me. I could really see even more clearly how these linguistic barriers basically were not a true reflection of what students' abilities were. So there was a mismatch between the cognitive demand and the language access. So these students were absolutely capable of deep conceptual thinking, but the language demands in the classroom basically prevented them from showing that. And that resulted again then in the impacts, of course, in any assessment outcomes, which is often misleading and unfair for these students. So when I moved to the International School of The Hague, I experienced this incredible combined journey, and I was part of that as the principal. And so in that school, I worked with Mindy, and we started seeing everything that was possible. And so that was really the motivation to write this book and share my experience and to start making these issues that I experienced visible so that educators could better understand what they were seeing in their own classrooms. And also, obviously, I then had to bring Mindy into this whole process because she is, of course, the expert with English language learning. In the past, Mindy and I, when we worked together, but even afterwards, we had countless conversations about how we could combine language development, conceptual development, and that they were actually not separate at all, and that they were deeply interconnected. It became very clear that in many places around the world, educators are integrating language and concept-based approaches, but for many others, the missing piece is simply that they really don't know what the best practices are, or even how to connect these approaches together as a coherent and practical way. So the book really grew out of that space, out of the desire to bridge that gap, to make those connections explicit, to offer practical ways to go forward, and to support teachers in feeling more confident and equipped in multilingual classrooms. Because ultimately, when we get this right, we're not just improving language outcomes, we're really unlocking students' ability to think, to understand, and to truly engage with their learning. And all of that was based on a sentence that I found in Erickson and Lanning's book. And it says, students need a language to communicate their thinking and to understand when they hear how others are thinking. And that was really the drive for us to start writing this book.
What a powerful, simple sentence that can change our perspective of how we see multilingual learners. Minnie, do you want to add anything?
I just want to say that Juliette partnering with me on this journey has been tremendously powerful. We know as educators that the backing of leadership is absolutely crucial in being able to start up a change process and bring people on board. And she gave me that warm embrace to experiment with teachers, classroom teachers, and my EAL team to innovate and find many different ways into this curriculum that would support our multilingual learners. So grateful to be on the journey with her.
So you add, Juliette, the leadership perspective. It's rare to see a principal with extensive EO experience, but then go into writing about that. So we appreciate your perspective here. The book has three sections on the brain, concept-based inquiry, and additional language learning. Can you please explain the importance of the first part that focuses on theory?
Yeah, so when we started shaping the book, we realized that everything really sits around the intersection of three key areas of learning. And that's to do with also theory and practice. So the first one is for us the curriculum design that you choose as a school, as a leader. What do you choose? The multilingual philosophy that you choose to have within your school setting. And then, of course, the pedagogy of teaching and learning itself. And it's that combination that makes the biggest difference. So if I start with the choices that we have made for the book, it's with starting with the curriculum. We specifically wanted to choose and moving towards a concept-based curriculum and instruction as developed by Lynn Erickson and Lois Lanning. And what that did or does is shift learning away from simply collecting facts. So even if you do inquiries, there are many times moments where schools just simply collect facts and present it. But this is shifting from that towards developing deeper understanding. And so in moving from a traditional two-dimensional curriculum, which focuses largely on content and skills alone, to a really good quality 3D curriculum, a three-dimensional curriculum where we intentionally add the third dimension, which is conceptual understanding. And it's not seen as an extra layer, it's really seen as a very vital element that brings coherence and meaning to the learning. So the three-dimensional curriculum ensures that knowledge and skills are not just taught in isolation, but that they are connected through transferable concepts and generalizations that students can then carry with them across the disciplines and the context. So a generalization is basically the big ideas that they get, the enduring understanding or conceptual understanding that the students will reach as a result of the unit under study. And furthermore, what I think is so special about this particular curriculum is that it focuses on the knowledge disciplines, which is in the structure of knowledge, as well as the process-based disciplines, so the structure of process, where the development of skills, strategies, and process of skill-based learning, and that brings the value to conceptual thinking. So through a curriculum choice, these students begin to see the patterns, meaningful connections, and they apply their meaning in the new and unfamiliar situations. They are no longer just recalling information, they are using critical thinking consistently to reason, to understand the world more deeply. So it's that conceptual dimension that acts as a bridge between knowing and understanding, enabling learners to move away from that surface level engagement to really deep intellectual depth of engagement. And so instead of memorizing isolated information, they begin to start seeing the bigger ideas that sit above that content. And of course, that can only be done in the context of language because that's how one learns. And that's where Mindy basically talks about the next aspect.
Thank you, Juliette. So the second aspect of our body of research centers around multilingualism. And as I mentioned previously, I work in a very special school, the International School of the Hague Primary, and we have been following the research findings from the multilingual field since 2005. And that is when we came into contact with the ECIS network, and we were put in touch with a group called the ESL and Mother Tongue Committee, now the MLI Committee, which has changed to focus on multilingualism. This specialized group, they organized regular conferences around this area, and they put us in touch with top researchers like Jim Cummins, Ophelia Garcia, and Eowyn Crisfield. So we've been very fortunate as a school to have access to their research-based guidelines, and that has developed our additional language practices for 2 decades now in a very high quality direction. There's a wealth of theory that shows how language is not just a tool for communication. Language is also a very important tool for thinking. And at our school, we live by this motto that was shared with us from Eowyn Crisfield via a researcher called Gravel. And the motto is, learning should never be put on hold while we wait for a child to acquire a language. So we have that in the back of our minds in everything that we try to do with language at our school. We know from the research that when students are able to use their full linguistic repertoire, their home languages, their identity languages, and the language of instruction, they can process ideas more deeply because they have access to their more developed languages, and they can use those languages to tackle the hard thinking. And they also have, therefore, more words in these languages to express themselves in. Once students reach a deep level of understanding, weaving across their languages, they're better able to transfer that understanding into a school setting, into an instructional task where they have to show their thinking in that new language. They just need the new word label in the new language to pin on top of the understanding that they've been able to dig at in their stronger languages. We understand as an international school that if we limit our students to working in just one language, we're not only limiting their expression, but we're limiting their ability to dig deep and to understand higher level inquiry tasks. As educators, we really want students to be able to reach their full potential. We want them to be able to unlock their full potential, and that means having access to all of their languages. Our understanding of what multilingual learners need in practice to thrive in an inquiry-based learning process is literally woven throughout the inquiry phases of the book, which come from Marshall and French. And we embody this weaving in the form of flexible scaffolding. Flexible scaffolding promotes not only a translanguaging stance, it promotes a multitude of additional language learning strategies, and that helps to keep learning accessible for all of our students who are learning through a language that isn't their home language or dominant one, and maybe in all different stages of English language learning. So that's where we are. Juliette will now talk about the teaching and learning that underpins deeper learning and thinking.
So then we have that third aspect that we were talking about, and that is the broader theories of teaching and learning. And basically, it's really focusing on what we really know about how the brain works, the importance, for instance, of accessing prior knowledge, how we engage the brain to make the connections, as well as what effective teaching looks like, and therefore meaningful learning is then actually happening in a classroom. So that's really another aspect of the book. And this includes ideas around the cognitive load and what hurdles language learners experience, which leads to the importance of making the thinking visible. So we are talking about using effective teaching strategies like some of the visible thinking routines, but also we very much promote the Marshall and French inquiry cycle that specifically uses an inquiry cycle that leads from engaging to a focus phase, as well as, they don't forget, an organized phase, which prepares really the students to get to these generalizations. And then again, we can't stop there because it's really the transfer that shows the real evidence of learning. So during this whole process, again, dialogue plays the crucial role. That's not just for multilingual learners, it's for every learner. Learning is inherently social, and talk is the tool for thinking. So again, that needs to be carefully structured. It's not just about let's put all the children in a group and hope for the best. It's very much focusing on how can we create purposeful opportunities for students to engage in academic conversations. And we do that through the generalizations and the connecting, guiding questions that come from that. And when that's done well, dialogue really becomes the bridge between the language and that conceptual understanding for all learners. But ultimately, all of this connects to the idea that learning is something that students actively construct. So it's not passing on information passively, memorizing facts. It's the students are making the meaning, are seeing the patterns, and are transferring understanding across contexts. So the role of teachers basically shift from maybe previously delivering knowledge. You are now the designer of the learning experiences that allow students to build that understanding themselves. And when you combine this with everything we've been talking about, concept-based learning, multilingualism, good teaching and learning, that's when you really start to see how powerful this can be. Because you're not just thinking about what you teach, but how students access it, process it, and ultimately understand and transfer this on their own and in whatever language. That's really powerful when all of that comes together. And when you have concept-based curriculum that promotes deep thinking, combine that with the understanding of multilingualism and valuing all the languages that you are dealing with, as well as those teaching approaches, that's when you start to see the real impact on learning. And believe me, it can blow your mind away, and you cannot go back once you've seen that. So students are not just learning more, I think they are learning better. And so they're able to think more critically, express themselves more fully, and ultimately perform in a way that truly reflects their intellectual potential. And that really is the multilingual learning space that we are trying to explore and promote and make practical for the educators who are reading the book.
Minnie, you want to add something?
I have a lot to add next because I'd love to share with you how this looks like in practice. So what was really important for us is that this was not just a theoretical book. There is a lot of research out there already, but we always hear from educators, yes, research, but what does this actually look like in my classroom? So we were very intentional about making this a practical book that translates theoretical ideas that we've been discussing, into everyday teaching. And that's why the second section of this book really focuses on practical implementation. It brings together those three areas that Juliette was mentioning. So we've got the teaching side of the curriculum. We've got choices that can be made throughout the inquiry, from direct instruction to more guided investigations. And we are developing multilingualism and additional languages within that process as well. So this book explores how inquiry and additional language learning can work together in practice, not as separate elements, but as an approach that's really fully integrated. So a big part of that is looking at what strong inquiry practice actually is, but also with a focus on the language barriers that arise for our additional language learners. I find that inquiry is often spoken a lot about in educational circles, but it's not always clearly understood. And for us, it's not just about asking students questions or doing activities together. It's about carefully designed learning experiences that guide our multilingual students towards a deeper conceptual understanding. It's about helping them make connections between concepts, between their languages, testing out their ideas, and refining their thinking over time. And all of this is done within a supportive language learning environment. So alongside that, we focus very practically on how to develop multilingual students within that inquiry-based process. Because one of the challenges that classroom teachers face is they're balancing two aspects at the same time. They're assisting students to access complex conceptual learning while also developing this in a new instructional language. And what we show through our dual process and through this book is there doesn't have to be a trade-off. You don't have to simplify learning tasks and the subsequent thinking that comes out of them in order to support the development of a new language. Instead, it's about providing the right scaffolds or strategies, like giving regular opportunities to develop academic oral fluency with structured supports, the use of visuals, creating learning spaces where multiple languages can be utilized to enhance the learning. And of course, we cannot leave behind explicit modeling, because our students need to be able to engage with ideas at their intellectual level, but they also need to have the precise academic language in order to do so. So if we put this all together, when this is done well, language development and conceptual understanding, they actually strengthen each other. Students are not only learning the language, they're using the language to think, to reason, and to express increasingly complex ideas. So the practical section of the book is really about making this intersection visible. We give educators concrete strategies, scaffolds, examples, and ways of thinking that they can immediately take into classrooms so that all students, especially their multilingual learners, can access deep, meaningful learning and share their thinking.
Can you actually share an example of that in a class? I know that you're still in school, so give us an example of what that looks like.
Yeah, I have several examples that I can share with you because we try to prepare different scaffolds all along the way through the inquiry-based process. So one very natural bridge is in concept formation. Concept formation could very well also be called academic vocabulary building, because a concept is actually an academic language word. So you might be working, for example, on the word ecosystem. As an EAL teacher, we're going to prepare that word for students to discuss and explore in visual, hands-on ways. But the nice part about concept-based inquiry is it actually lends itself towards multiple exposures of that same word. So we're not going to just discuss it once. We're not going to explore it once through one context or one object or one picture. We're not just going to translate it once. We're going to look at that particular concept of ecosystems through a lot of different case studies. Case studies is how inquiry-based learning frames visual texts and written text that can support students' understanding of a concept through a wider view. So we're going to watch videos on how ecosystems work. We're going to break down the language in those videos for how ecosystems work. We're going to look at texts that are at different levels of English to support their development of academic English, but we're going to annotate and translate alongside to make sure that they're fully understanding what that concept can look like across multiple contexts. So in that way, our students get a really good deal from working through a concept-based lens, because they get the deep exploration into a word from multiple sides, whether that's a meaning-based side in context, through grammar, through translation, through visual support, over and over, until they actually transfer that word into other contexts. So that's one very natural way that we bridge from the EL field into concept-based inquiry. Another really great strategy that again originates from concept-based inquiry, but we can tweak it, is the FRAIR model, which I'm sure you've heard about. Like, you go through a grid type exploration of, again, a concept, which is also an academic language word, and you're going to explore it through what it is and what it isn't. So through examples and non-examples, but these examples could be concrete. If I'm working with younger students and we are exploring living versus non-living things, then I might actually have figures that they can manipulate and sort to try and clarify what is a living thing versus a non-living thing. If I have older students, they might annotate their examples through visuals or home language translations, which are available to them like all along the way. But where it gets very tricky and where we put a lot of emphasis is, of course, on the case studies themselves, because researching in the investigate phase of Marshall and French is a very big part of concept-based learning, that students investigate and find connections between concepts and words themselves through their own research. But we all know that academic research is heavily filled with academic language. And if not offered at a level that a student can access, then they're not able to kind of break down and understand what's in that piece of research. So what we do as EL teachers working alongside class teachers is we create and generate, often with the help of Gemini, a lot of different leveled English texts that will support certain underpinning concepts that students can then access more easily when investigating what that concept actually is and means and how it's deployed in the real world. But we also spend quite a lot of time teaching them how to explicitly note take, because that's another academic skill that we cannot assume children will just know how to do. Often, when left to their own devices, our students will copy out notes from text verbatim that they don't understand. So it's about breaking down the strategies within note-taking they can use to make the words their own. But the real key is about making sure that the texts are at a level they can access. And of course, they then always have the option to use home language, to flip parts of it into home language for stronger comprehension. So those are some of the examples that exist in our book to make this process of concept-based inquiry more accessible for our multilingual students.
Juliette, do you want to add anything?
No, actually, she's done a really good job. She's talked about very important phases. The concept formation phase is indeed a very important aspect of that. Because again, we're talking about its language for multilingual learners, but as we know, academic language is new to every child. So concept-based learning means that concept formation questions are actually vital for every learner. It's not just for the multilingual learner. And so the focus phase where she talks about the Freya model is in that sense also that development of the deeper understanding for all learners.
So you've both mentioned the Marshall and French framework for inquiry. Would you go through that process? Because not everyone will have a understanding of that framework yet.
Over to you, Juliette.
Yes, so Marshall and French wrote a wonderful book, Concept-Based Inquiry in Action. It was published in 2018. And where previously other schools had maybe used other forms of inquiry cycles, we specifically started using this particular inquiry cycle because it has a particular cycle that, in my opinion, really leads very strongly to that conceptual understanding and the transfer. So the phases that they identify is an engage phase, a focus phase, investigate phase, organize phase, which is often forgotten in other inquiry cycles, then the generalize phase, and then the transfer phase. And around that is a continuous reflection, of course. So they haven't made that as a separate phase because you are reflecting continuously. And there's obviously the flexibility of moving between those particular phases. It's not that this is the cycle that you need to use. But when we started working with this particular inquiry cycle from Marshall and French, we really experienced something completely differently that I had seen in other schools where I used other inquiry cycles. And it really had to do with the steps that you were moving through this organized phase to the transfer or to the generalized phase and the transfer. And I believe that's really where a lot of the strength comes from. And the fact that you write concept formation questions, factual questions, as well as conceptual questions for every generalization, which means that you, with your whole class, with all learners, you are developing that deeper understanding in the form of very practical experiences. So you go from concrete to very much abstract rather than from what we see many times from abstract to concrete. That's the wrong way around, in our opinion. And we've seen that. And particularly, I think, when you have multilingual learners, they need that concrete part, that experience, that tapping into the prior knowledge in languages, in their own languages, through play, through experiences that you create, that you design for this class, basically, to reach that abstract level. So that's a very important aspect of a concept-based curriculum, yes.
So staying with that, why do you believe that the combined approach of concept-based inquiry and additional language learning is beneficial for multilingual learners?
Yeah, so one of the ideas is really, I think the key idea is that the role shifts from the learner. So basically, the teaching approach that we encourage is an inductive teaching model, and that's where the students are doing the thinking for themselves. So rather than starting with an explanation of learning objectives, the lesson begins with strong guiding questions that I just talked about. And the students explore, and these are addressed basically through the concrete case studies. And there are multiple case studies because you can't find connections with just one case study. You need to have multiple case studies. And from there, you basically gradually build towards that abstract understanding. And what supports this process is that clear inquiry cycle that we were just talking about, because it is a very purposeful, deeper, transferable understanding that you're aiming for. And obviously, then that transfer phase, because that shows you that the children have really learned. Now, what is of course extra interesting is when you start connecting that with the language development for the multilingual learners. So what Mindy was describing as well is what is so beautiful about this particular inquiry cycle is that you experience that abstract concept across different subjects, and you see it recurring basically as a key abstract concept. So systems, change, relationships, those kinds of things. And because they come back in all these different areas, they are basically helping the students develop that academic language for all students, but CALP, of course, for the students who are learning the language. And that basically shifts it from connecting that abstract and concrete together, but you start with the concrete. They build up a much stronger and a more lasting connection because it makes sense to them. And so they're no longer learning, any learner is no longer learning academic words in isolation. They are understanding what those words really mean in the different contexts. So over time, that means a great transfer, not just a transfer of conceptual understanding, but also of languages. So transfer is double in our opinion. So the moment you start combining that, that's where what we have been calling the unified thinking happens. It's where the different ideas, the perspectives, the pieces of knowledge all come together in this coherent whole, and it's no longer fragmented. And neither is it fragmented in different languages. It all comes together. So it is very much connecting, meaningful in any language, and strengthening both languages, or three languages or four languages. And that's where that unified thinking is so important in this process. So you move away from that teaching of content, because you're no longer just teaching language, and you're not just teaching content. You develop both of them together, and that reinforces deep understanding in multiple languages. And when other students hear that, particularly at Ish, where we had over 80 languages, it's fantastic to see how that enhances the learning process, and therefore the understanding for the transfer possibilities. But the other part that I think is an incredibly valuable aspect of this particular curriculum that we promote is we have that structure of knowledge, and we have the structure of process. And so any process-driven, concept-based learning is often misunderstood, because they still think, what students do is important. But for us, it's missing that conceptual depth, that conceptual lens. And so the concept-based curriculum still focuses on those skills, on the strategies, on the processes, and that elevates it through a conceptual lens. And that basically then means that they will be having some understanding of why authors do what they do, why painters do what they do, why readers use fluency, or why musicians use tempo. It's not just isolated in a particular text, it's basically coming together. So it is these processes together that creates that deeper understanding. And in the end, it's not choosing between a skill or concept. It's about respecting every skill, every strategy, every process, and it's anchored in understanding. So learning becomes transferable, purposeful, and most importantly, in our multilingual world, it's lasting across language as well. So we add that extra layer to that. And this is where the valuable bridge is to additional language learning. There's room for this process model by explicit teaching of language skills, explicit teaching of language strategies or processes. And that's what makes it successful, learning a new language in this way. So multilingual students need that explicit instruction. I mean, Mindy and I have had many discussions about that in the past. And the process of the structure of process is therefore so valuable within that kind of setting. It's skill-based teaching that we are used to delivering, while adding that conceptual layer of understanding, and that will cultivate asking students to think more deeply about the why of the skills, the why of the strategies, the why of the processes. And that, of course, then transfer to other languages as well. So students can actually, and teachers can understand better what you do when you have multiple languages in your head. And so that in itself can become a generalization.
Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I'm actually so excited to hear Juliette talking about explicit instruction in the context of inquiry-based teaching, because sometimes that is considered controversial, but there is definitely a place for it. And it's very encouraging to see that in the process-based model, there is this set and fixed place for skill-based teaching. So all the work we do as language teachers across genres, across grammar, across vocabulary, which we can also now call conceptual understanding and the building up of concepts, that all fits under the process model. So we continue to deliver the high quality explicit language practices that we need to deliver for students whose languages work in different ways than the language of school. But then we just indeed take it that one step further to help them understand why we use that skill in that way, or why we use this word in this context, so that they have that understanding, almost like someone who can tinker with languages. What's the best word? What's the best sentence structure for this particular message that I'm bringing across? So to have the discussions around why we use language in the way that we do, but still explicitly teach the conventions that they need to have a grasp on to be successful, is like the best of both worlds. And I want to share one really powerful example that comes from a group of students that I worked with sometime last year. In my EL system, we would call them stage 1 pluses, which means that they've gotten orally fluent, but the reading and writing is still shaky, and it's taking more time to build up. But we've been working in the concept-based inquiry way on the topic of migration, and we've been exploring migration words through different case studies, through the real journeys that people went through. Whether it was through a war-torn country, whether it was because of economic pressures, like exploring a personal journey of why someone came to move to a different place. And of course, children brought in all their personal connections for why they'd moved to the Netherlands or why they weren't in their own home country. So that already made it a very lasting connection for them. But then we came towards the end of the inquiry cycle. And of course, I'd made my visual vocabulary strips that we'd been working with across these different case studies. They had annotated them, they'd put their own notes on them, they had added in home language translations, and I put them all in a big pile on the table, and I said, choose some. I didn't say 2 or 3, I didn't limit it. I said, choose some of these concepts that you find interesting or that you know a lot about, and see if you can find some connections between them. And then I'd like you to explain them to me. And I had these students who, under the guise of the EL system that were considered, low level in their literacy skills, make these very powerful connections between these concepts to show their understanding of migration. And they often told it in terms of a story. Like first, you're leaving your country because you don't have safety. And that was the academic word or concept that we were trying to build up with them. What is safety? What does it look like? What does it mean if you feel safe? What kinds of things do you have in your life if you have safety? And when you get to a new country, you might not have the language yet that you need to work there. Language was another concept that we explored. Multilingualism was a concept that we explored. And then what happens when you're trying to integrate, this was another one of our words, into this new context where you don't have the language or you don't yet have the skill set to find your way through. And they told this small story of someone going through this journey. And then in the end, they said, you do have safety and you do have the language and you find a place where you belong. And to me, that was so much more powerful than asking them, what does belong mean? Can you translate that into your home language? I was therefore at that point made a real believer in this approach because it had given my children the opportunity to encounter all these concepts, but in lots of different contexts, making them much more powerful language users when it came to the end of the unit. And I do think that will transfer because it was kind of also part of their own stories.
So this leads us to our last question. What are some of the struggles that you as educators have experienced bringing a concept-based inquiry and EL together?
Yeah, I think it is an important question to ask because there's always going to be challenges when you're bringing change to your setting and you're disrupting what teachers are used to doing. And I think teachers are always under pressure, right? They're trying to balance multiple demands from so many different kinds of students every day, and they're navigating complex systems and bureaucracy. So to try and add one more to that, It's not always easy, but we really believe that, and we put a lot of effort on to planning. One of the key areas to be successful in bringing this combined approach really to reality is in the planning. And luckily in my school, we have EL teachers working alongside classroom year group teams each week to try and identify where the language challenges, barriers might be, and to build in scaffolds that would be appropriate for different levels of students. But not every school is my school, and not every school can afford to have an EL teacher in every year group. It's not always practical. So it's about trying to create a mindset through trainings, through discussions, like Juliette and I do on a regular basis, of understanding that under every curriculum, no matter what it is, there are going to be language demands. And if you don't have that in your mind, and you don't have something in place to help students overcome those barriers, then a lot of your learning is lost. So it's having lots of discussions, not just, once a year, but like on weekly meetings of, in this particular text, there's a lot of academic language. So what are we going to do about it to make sure our students actually grasp what's happening here? And that's a long journey, and it takes a long time. But when you have that mindset in place across multiple year groups, then it becomes collective and whole. And I think the other part is creating that multilingual ethos that everyone needs to be part of for that multiple languages idea to thrive. That if students can't access in one language, they can use another, because the goal is we want them to understand and we want them to complete their learning. We want them to develop their cognitive potential. And so we do that in a very simple way, and I have seen this happening in other schools as well. We do that by promoting classroom-based language policies every year. It's part of our multilingual me that we do across the school to make students aware of themselves as multilingual learners. And part of that is to create a classroom-based language policy where the teacher poses prompts like, why are languages important? How do speaking different languages, how does that make you feel? How can they help you to learn? And then through the student responses, they create a kind of policy where they say our languages are important, they're valued, they're useful through their own words, and here are some of the ways we're going to use them. And if that goes up on the wall, it sets the tone for the whole year. A student shouldn't have to ask you if it's okay for them to use their home language in your room. They should feel like it's a flexible learning tool, and they're empowered to pick it up whenever they need to, whether it's during concept-based inquiry units or it's a math lesson. So that, I think those two together, working on the planning and the language policies, brings you quite far.
Juliette, would you like to add anything?
No, but I would like to talk about one particular hurdle that I think is very appropriate for this particular conversation, and it is to do that. It is not to do with just multilingualism, but basically I can see class teachers still really struggle when they have to write generalizations in general, but specifically actually when they have to write generalizations for the structure of process. And what we often see is that they then rely heavily on basically concept-based generalizations. And so they do find it very difficult to express process-based, skill-based, or strategy-based, or process-based generalizations. So, for instance, if you take something in literacy, a planner might have the strands of understanding text, responding to text, critiquing text, and producing text. And we want to move away from just focusing on what the students do, but move into that deeper conceptual understanding. And therefore, we need really good generalizations for that. So why readers do what they do, or why artists use specific processes in their art, or why writers use particular word choice. But that's actually a much harder process than people think. I mean, when you show generalizations to class teachers, they go, oh yeah, that sounds all very good and easy, but it is actually a much harder process than we think it is. So bringing that conceptual lens into any of the process subjects or disciplines starts by not, how do we understand the text, but more what does it mean to interpret meaning in text? Or, you don't say just how do we critique, it's about how do the perspective differ and why? And so these particular strands, understanding, responding, critiquing, and producing, is moving a little bit away from what many teachers know as reading, writing, listening, speaking. And so that's one of the ones that is quite difficult. But it still is a vehicle to be exploring this bigger idea with the conceptual lens of, for instance, perspective or interpretation or audience. So again, trying to identify the particular skills and strategies and processes and make sure that they don't disappear and that they become a tool in service of deeper thinking. And that's a real shift that needs to happen. And so moving away from that surface level performance within process-based subjects is a really big shift. But you want to continue with the rigor. You want to keep it demanding. You want students to think conceptually, make the connections, and articulate those generalizations rather than this is what we learned in one text or a task. And so it's really about why are the skills important? Why are the strategies important? And getting that into a generalization is in the planning stage quite difficult. However, it is what is the difference between doing the learning and really truly understanding the learning. So that's what we're basically trying to do. We have lots of, in fact, there are two chapters that specifically focus. One chapter on the hurdles that we have experienced for multilingualism and the strategies, as well as another chapter just on concept-based inquiry issues that we have encountered. And it really is to try and show that there are solutions and that there are steps, and that there's scaffolding needed for teachers when they start with this process, because ultimately we don't want to remove the challenge. We really want to make the challenge accessible and doable in all subjects for both students and the teachers.
Well, I think your book is going to make it accessible and doable for both students and teachers by removing some of the barriers that you've talked about in your very clear strategy. So, Juliette and Mindy, the book that you have gifted the field is Teaching Conceptual Understanding in Multilingual Classrooms, that I hope will be in many classrooms around the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.